Hello everyone, my name is Brandy Hodson and welcome to my presentation on the role of female religious officials in Deir el-Medina during the reign of Ramesses II. This is a topic I found fascinating for many different reasons, but most especially because it just highlights a lesser known but important part of ancient Egyptian life, and that is how women actively contributed to religious practices, especially in smaller communities like Deir el-Medina. And just to give you a quick timeline, so you'll know kind of what we're looking at, it is Ramesses II. He reigned from 1279 to 1213 BC, and that is during what is known as the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom. He's often referred to as Ramesses the Great because of how long he ruled and the massive number of temples and statues and monuments that he built. And what really drew me to this time period is that Ramesses II was also the pharaoh most often associated with the biblical story of Moses and the Exodus, although scholars would still kind of debate whether that's historically accurate. But the city of Pi Ramses, which he built, is actually mentioned in the book of Exodus, and that is part of why that connection kind of stuck in popular tradition. I chose to focus on Deir el-Medina because it gives us an unusually detailed look into daily life in ancient Egypt, thanks to all the written records that were left behind by the workers there. And what really stood out to me was how women weren't just bystanders. They were holding titles and making offerings and participating in community rituals in meaningful ways. So with that in mind, I want to kind of dive deeper and explore how these women helped shaped religious life in one of the ancient Egypt's most unique communities. So, as I mentioned in the introduction slide, this presentation will center around one key question, and I have it there. What impact did female religious officials in Deir el-Medina have on spiritual life under Ramesses II? And I'll be honest, I actually thought this would be a tough topic to find sources and information about. But as it turns out, it is true that the scholars there and the people that were living at that time really did keep great detailed records, and it really helped my research, and it's helped other people's research before me and people that I kind of got to use off of that too. So, but based on my research and what I've looked into it, I believe women had a significant impact on religious life at that time. They were far from just being silent participants in a male-dominated religion. There are so many inscriptions and stelae and scholarly sources that show women were, actually part of all of this and doing things. And so what I found paints a much richer picture of their influence and leadership. So what you're looking at here is where Deir el-Medina was actually located, and it's located, or was located, in Upper Egypt on the west side of the Nile and across from where Luxor is today. And back then that area was known as Thebes. It was tucked into this little desert valley really close to the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, and that location makes so much sense because the people who lived in Deir el-Medina were the ones building and decorating the royal tombs that were nearby. And one of the coolest things about this village is really how literate the people were for that time, because back then most Egyptians couldn't read or write, but these workers would have had these skills for the job that they were doing there. Because of that, Thankfully, they've left behind a ton of written stuff, like letters and lists and prayers and even personal notes that were scratched onto walls. And that's a huge deal for historians because it gives us, such a detailed look at how they lived. And their religious life was so rich too. They didn't just worship in big temples. They had shrines at home, and they carved prayers into stones, and they had personal rituals that mattered a lot to them. So you see these really interesting blend of official religion and personal devotion, and that's part of what makes this place so special, especially when we start looking at all the women and how involved that they really were. In Deir el-Medina, some women actually held official religious titles, which really surprised me when I first started researching this, because one of the most important titles is, as you can see, servant of the god. And I'm not even going to attempt to say that word with the HMTNTR, but in Egyptian it means servant of the god. And that title didn't just sound fancy, it meant they were recognized as having a legitimate role in religious practices. And most of the time those roles were connected to the goddess, like Hathor, who was associated with love and music and motherhood, and Merit Seeger, a cobra goddess who protected the Theban necropolis and punished those who behaved badly. And these goddesses were especially important to people in Deir el-Medina, probably because of their connection to tomb building and protection in the afterlife. And again, this is a city that's really important around those things. So now these women weren't part of the high-ranking priesthood that you'd see at big temples like Karnak and Luxor, but they were still respected within their communities. Their influence might not have shown up in state records, but it mattered in everyday life. They were leading rituals and making offerings and passing on traditions and conducting these prayers. And it just goes to show that spiritual leadership wasn't always about status. Sometimes it was about presence and being part of something in their local faith life. Okay. So after looking at their formal titles and roles, I kind of shifted the focus to something a bit more personal, and I wanted to see what religious life looked like domestically in their homes. And so in Deir el-Medina, religion wasn't limited to the temples and public spaces. A lot of the spiritual activity took place in people's houses. Families had small domestic shrines or altars, and it was often the women who took responsibility for keeping these spaces active and alive, and they would lead prayers and make offerings and keep up daily rituals that helped their families stay connected to the gods. And this really shows how women were spiritual leaders in their own right. So especially within the household, and even if they didn't hold high-ranking temple positions, they were the ones keeping religion alive in their homes and with their children and their families, and these everyday moments. It was beyond just caregiving and teaching the traditions. They were really truly creating sacred spaces in their homes. And to me, that challenges the idea that religious power always has to be official or public. It really, in this case, it was personal and consistent, and it was just meaningful. So this slide gets into what I found to be one of the most fascinating parts of my whole research, women's involvement in oracles and personal spiritualities. So in Deir el-Medina, sorry, there's my laundry. When people had serious questions like, whether they should make a big decision or what to do about a family issue, or, just to see if somebody was even being honest with them, they didn't rely on gossip or rumors or guesswork or any of that stuff. They just, they went to the gods, and the way they did that was through oracle consultation, and this is what I really found fascinating. But what's really interesting about this is that women weren't just watching these things happen, they were involved. And when we're talking about oracles, we're talking, it's kind of like a modern day psychics and mediums and tarot cards, just trying to figure out, like, kind of like a magic 8-ball in a way. So some women actually interpreted signs and helped facilitate this process, and that shows that they had a lot of trust in their spiritual insight. And also, they were deeply connected to household rituals. And this part reminded me of how people today might light a candle when they go to say a prayer, or have a special place in their home for reflection. I've heard of like prayer closets and stuff. And in Deir el-Medina, women were the ones leading these rituals. And so they would offer food and incense or prayers to the gods from within their homes. And it wasn't just going through the motions either. These rituals were seen as meaningful and effective ways to sort of maintain spiritual blessings and protect the family. So I found that was probably one of my favorite parts of this whole research. It was just interesting, and there's so much more to it I wish I could touch on. But so at this point you might be wondering, how do we actually know all this stuff, but particularly how do we know that women played a significant role in these religious positions, or in important religious roles in Deir el-Medina? So I looked at the evidence and some of the things that were left behind, the art and writings these women left behind. And we're talking about stelae, which are those carved stone slabs like I've got put on here. And these things are like, you would see these in museums, and often with images or inscriptions, and they were deliberate public acts of devotion. And when a woman is shown offering something to a god on a stele, that's saying, I have a relationship with this deity and it matters enough to make it permanent. So what makes it even more meaningful is that some of these stelae include the woman's name and her religious title, and that kind of recognition etched in stone isn't something that would happen for just anyone. It suggests that the community respected her role, not only as a wife and a mother, but as someone with spiritual authority. And it's kind of like being remembered in your church or your community today as someone who really shaped people's faith journey, like a youth leader, a prayer group organizer, or someone always there for others in tough times, your pastor, your Sunday school teacher. And these women weren't forgotten. Their names were carved into history as spiritual guides, as leaders, as beloved figures in their families and communities. Okay, so we mentioned these two earlier, but I'm going to touch on it again a little bit. But Hathor is the goddess of motherhood and music and joy, and she was someone women connected with on a personal level, and the things that she like, they prayed to her for things like fertility and love and emotional healing, and she was part of their everyday lives, not just worshipped in these big temples. And there's also, and I hope I say it right, but Merit Seeger, the Cobra goddess, and she was such an important figure, and she was part of protecting the Valley of the Kings, and people saw her as powerful but also kind of forgiving. And women prayed to her when they felt they had done something wrong or needed healing. And worshiping these goddesses gave women a sense of identity and spiritual power. And I could see that being something real today for a lot of women. And it wasn't just about tradition. It was something that was deeply personal for women. And that connection helped women claim a respected place in the religious life of their communities. One of the most meaningful takeaways from my research is how deeply personal religion was for women in this area. And, you know, as I've said, they didn't need formal temples to connect with the divine. Their homes were sacred spaces, and many women managed household shrines, and their spiritual lives were woven into their daily routines, whether it was offering prayers, even while they're cooking, and asking for protection during childbirth, or turning to the gods during illnesses. Spirituality was a constant presence, and it wasn't something separate from being a wife or mother. It was a part of their role. It was part of their being. And women carried the spiritual weight of their household, and that's what made their presence so important, not just socially, but, religiously too. So really, why does all of this matter? And how does it compare to the rest of Egypt? And I'll go back here, but in most places across ancient Egypt, women's religious roles weren't recorded in such rich, detailed way that it was in Deir el-Medina. And we know women were involved in temple rituals and home worship throughout Egypt, but it usually was hard to find their names and their titles and their personal expressions of faith, and we don't have those things like we do from Deir el-Medina. The records didn't survive, or they just weren't written at all. But in Deir el-Medina, we see women's religious roles documented clearly, and that's thanks to the village's high literacy rate and how close-knit the community was. They really did just write everything down, from work rosters and prayers to stelae honoring women's offerings. And so this village gives us an exceptionally it's a great case study of female religious leadership at that local level. So as I wrap up this presentation, I think it's important to sort of look at the bigger picture here. So the women of Deir el-Medina weren't just participating in religion, they were helping shape a spiritual identity, not even just of their homes or for themselves, but for their entire community. And through prayer offerings and shrine keeping and even interpreting signs from the gods, they created a kind of grassroots spiritual leadership that honestly challenges a lot of our assumptions about gender roles in the ancient world. And so we tend to think of power in ancient Egypt as belonging only to the men, the pharaohs, and the priests and the officials. But here we have real evidence that women in their homes and local shrines held a different kind of power, and it's personal. They had spiritual authority and was deeply respected by the people that were in their communities and around them. And Deir el-Medina gives us something rare. We have the actual names, the titles, the records, and it shows female agency in a society that didn't always document women's roles. And that's what makes this site kind of special, and this topic special and powerful. And it gives voice to women whose stories would have otherwise been lost to time. And so to bring everything together, I just want to say this research really changed the way I think about religion in the ancient world. like in my mind, it was just these big temples and male priests, and it's male dominated. But we actually see that here in Deir el-Medina, female religious officials played an essential role in keeping the spiritual life of the village alive and meaningful. And the spiritual world here was rich and complex, and it wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into just the everyday general things that they did and women, their child rearing and cooking and motherhood, their community celebrations, and how they dealt with illnesses and justice, and just prepared their decisions. And most importantly, it's clear that women's participation mattered at that time, not just behind the scenes. They weren't just stuck at home. This was very open. And their work in both public rituals and private devotion shaped what religion looked like for their families and for their neighbors. And that's something I'm probably going to carry with me after this project, and not just a better understanding of Egyptian history, but also a deeper appreciation for the quiet, powerful ways women have shaped spiritual life in every culture. Thanks so much. Have a good day. Bye.